In this week's reading, the portion of Mishpatim, we read about the laws pertaining to a Jewish court. Which judge qualifies to be a judge on a Jewish court, and which judge does not? A person could be proficient in all aspects of Torah, but he does not possess the ordination that was transmitted from Moshe from generation to generation. He's not qualified to render any decision which is rendered by a court, any levels of judgment, whether it's monetary, whether it's penalty, whether it's punishment, whether it's lashes, whether it's death penalty. He's not qualified to issue that kind of verdict. You have to have that level of ordination. And it's all based on verses. This is divine law. This is biblical law. This is Torah law. That's first and foremost. I'm not even speaking about level of honesty and integrity that the person has to have. But just in terms of the caliber and the qualification, you must be ordained by Moshe Rabbeinu. Meaning, Moshe ordained a certain group of people. Those people carry ordination. They're in a position to ordain others because they possess that ordination. We find in this week's reading that the judge is referred to as Elohim. Elohim, in the context which is discussed here, means the judge. That means a judge who has that level of connection to God himself. He's imbued with that divine spirit due to the ordination that he carries. And when he sits within the context of what a court is, which we discuss in a moment, then he's qualified to render and issues those kinds of verdicts. As I said, monetary penalty, corporal punishment, all that, to determine the sanctification of the moon. When does the month begin, which determine the holidays? That's the sanctification of the moon. You have to have this level of ordination. If not, you're not qualified to make that decision when and where. Okay? There's a court of three judges. There's a court of 23 judges. And there's a court, which is one court, of 71 judges. 70, and there's a chief justice, which presides over the 70. Every community that has a minimum of a certain amount of people must have a court of 23. The Jewish court is called Sanhedrin. But the court of every community that has to have 23 is called Sanhedrin Ketano. It's the lesser court. It's like you have a state Supreme Court, then you have the Supreme Court, which presides over the whole country. Lahavdil. Then you have a court of 71, which convenes on the Temple Mount alongside the sanctuary. Again, this is all prescribed by the Torah itself. These are divine laws, not rabbinic laws. So every community has to have a court of 23, and that court could issue verdicts relating to death penalty. A court of three could issue monetary penalty and lashes, which is a level of corporal punishment. But you must have minimally 23 to issue a verdict of death penalty. But the ultimate court is the court that convenes on the Temple Mount. You know, the law is now that in terms of evidence, for a court to issue a decision, they have to receive credible evidence. There's only one type of evidence which is accepted by the Torah, which is the equivalent of factual evidence. What is that? It's the testimony of two witnesses. Two witnesses who meet the qualifications of what a valid witness is. It has to be, firstly, they cannot be related to either the defendants. They cannot be related to the members who sit on the court. They must be of a certain degree of integrity. If they violated certain laws, stealing, don't observe the Shabbos, they eat not kosher, certain types of laws, they're disqualified. They're not qualified to sit on the court. Witnesses, if they're dishonest, they engage in dishonest practices, they're not credible. You have to meet certain criteria to be that witness. Even Moshe himself, as great as he was, if he should be testifying in a court, you have to have two witnesses. Moshe and Aaron being brothers, they can't testify together because they're related to one another. If you're related, you're not qualified to testify. The two people who testify cannot be related to one another. They can't be related to the defendant, whether it's the benefit of the defendant to find the defendant guilty or to the judges. These are all laws which are divine laws. That is the context of the court system. Now, even witnesses who are credible in terms of their qualification, when they testify, before we rule on their testimony, the witnesses have to be interrogated. Why do they have to be interrogated? To make sure, in terms of the accuracy, people see things differently. So therefore, the two witnesses, when they're interrogated and ask certain pertinent questions. If there's any discrepancy in the testimony of one to the other when they're interrogated before the court, they're disqualified. They have to basically be saying the same thing. And if after all the 7 questions, which is the basis for interrogation, they make it through interrogations, they're credible witnesses to testify before the court. After the court hears the testimony, they have to evaluate it. Is the man guilty? Is he not guilty? Was he forewarned? Was he not forewarned? Whether he's liable for punishment? Many things are included within the laws of judgment. But if you meet all the criteria which are prescribed by the Torah, the court can issue a ruling, which even if the verdict is guilty and death penalty, the person is put to death. That's the law. That's the Torah law. What happens if 2 witnesses testify, they're interrogated, and the court issues a verdict, death penalty. And then afterwards, 2 other witnesses come and say to the court, the 2 witnesses testified and the guilty verdict was issued, those 2 witnesses, they couldn't have seen the crime. Why? Because they were with us elsewhere. You believe, the Torah says you believe the latter group, and the first witnesses are classified as conspiring witnesses. They conspired to take the life of an innocent person. What is the law regarding conspiring witnesses? What they conspired to bring upon that defendant, we do to them. So if their testimony would have brought about a verdict of death penalty, they're put to death. The conspiring witnesses. What happens? The defendant was put to death due to their testimony. After everything's said and done. But you understand, you can't bring a person back to life. So the question now is, if in fact we see after everything's said and done, it's still possible human error because the witnesses hoodwinked the court. They made it through interrogation. Later, they were found out to be lying. They conspired. So the court decision caused an innocent man to be put to death. So how does the Torah say that the court rules with it, and every human being is subject to human error? How does the Torah say? How could this be true justice? And the Talmud tells us that the signet of God is truth. Truth means unadulterated truth. And I always say the name of the Maharal. What is truth? 99.9999, stop, keep going, or it has to be absolute truth. So Maharal says, the way you spell truth in Hebrew, it's emes, Aleph, Mem, Tov. If you take the Aleph away from Mem and Tov, what do you have left? Memtov, you have mace, death. So that means if you detract from truth as much as an iota, because the olive represents something minuscule, what's left is death. So if the signet of God is truth, how could God install a system where it's possible that an innocent man should have his life being taken? Because we see here, if the witnesses are found to be conspiring, you put them to death for conspiring. But what happens if it's too late? The witness who proved they conspired, it came after the man was put to death. You put an innocent man to death. So how do we reconcile this with God's signet being truth on the absolute level? Okay? Basic question. I remember years ago, in the 50s, we debated in school capital punishment. Should they abolish capital punishment? Should not abolish capital punishment? Because it's a deterrent to this and that. And we used to have debates about it. The Torah says there is capital punishment. And what was the argument? It should not be? Because you put a person in prison, at least eventually, if you find out he was innocent, he can be released. But once you take his life is over. Therefore, it's we considered the wrong thing to have capital punishment. These were the sides of the issue. Well, no, for the sake of society, since most times the man is guilty, we don't have to worry. We don't have to be concerned for the ultimate sake of society. But the Torah is truth. The signet of God is truth. If that's the case, if factually the witnesses can be found out that it was faulty evidence because they lied, how does the Torah allow the court to take the life of an innocent person? Theoretically, he could be innocent, although we're putting him to death. It's an obvious question. Obvious? If you know enough, it's obvious. So the answer is very simple. The Talmud tells us, based on a verse in Tehillim, and the Midrash cites this verse, Elokim Nitzav Badas Kel. God himself convenes with the court, with the Jewish court. Meaning, the Jewish court, which meets all the criteria of what a credible court is, the number of judges, the qualification of the judges, meet all aspects of being qualified. God says when they sit in judgment and they process and evaluate evidence, guilty or innocent, I participate in that decision. And I give them a level of clarity that the decision, the verdict is absolute truth. I am associated with them. I convene with every court that convenes, as long as it's a credible court. It's not credible, I don't convene with them. But if it's credible, and what's credible, they meet all the criteria that are set by the Torah, which are divine prerequisites, I will sit, I convene with that court, and the judges see through my eyes. So it's not just the human faculty called the brain, the intellectual component of human being that brings about this decision. Because even after everything's said and done, there's human error. No human error. The man is guilty beyond any doubt. So we have a problem, but he was found out. We found out that the evidence through which we put them to death was faulty evidence. What was the proof? Because the witness was found to be conspiring. So if that's the case, how could it be a judgment which is truth? Clearly, it was based on the evidence. The man shouldn't have been put to death. So we have an innocent man went to his death. The answer is, he may have not been guilty for this particular crime, but factually, God says this man must be put to death. And what's the vehicle through which we're going to put him to death? It's going to be the judicial system. So it may not be because he committed murder, or it may not be because he raped a married woman, or he committed incest, or he violated Shabbos. That's not the reason. But God wanted this man to be taken out. And therefore, God put in these minds of the minds of these judges who met all the criteria of what the judicial system is, that the man has to be found guilty and put to death. Therefore, it's not called human error. The verdict was evaluated and decided by God, the man is guilty. Guilty to put to death is at whatever the court says, whether it's by stoning, whether it's dying by the sword, by fire, strangle, whatever it may be. That's the verdict, and that's the background on the verdict. So it's not the event necessarily, but it's the guilt. He is classified as a guilty person, therefore he's put to death. Therefore, it's not possible to even come with a level of criticism. What about human error? There's no human error. That's Elokim Nitzav Vaskel. So the judgment of the human court is really a divine verdict. It's divine. Okay? Now, the Gemara tells us, the Talmud tells us, that a judge who judges issues a verdict, which is emes lamito shel Torah. Its truth, its truthfulness is the ultimate, absolute truth. God says, he is my partner in creation. He's nasa shutim b'kodesh baruch hu ma'aseh bereshis. He's God's partner in creation. But if he's corrupt, even for a penny, God says, I will take his soul. God says, I will take that judge out. So the obvious question is, rendering a decision which is truthful, absolute truth. God says, you're my partner in creation. But if you go and even as much as a cent, and you extract money which you're not permitted to due to your decision, God says, your life is worthless. I will take your life. So the Talmud says, if that's the case, who would want to sit on a court? He may make a mistake and, for a cent, he'll be taken out. So the Talmud says, no. A judge has to do his best. As long as he's qualified to be the judge, he's proficient in the subject matter, and he follows all the protocols prescribed by the Torah, then he has no liability. However, when the judge sits in judgment, he has to see himself as if a double-edged sword is between his legs. And if he should deviate to any degree in either direction, he'll be cut in half. That's the level of trepidation he has to sit and evaluate with such precision to do his best to issue that truthful verdict. But if there's any sense that the judge feels he's conflicted, he has to disqualify himself from the case. That's the Talmud. So I ask the question, if a person steals $1 million, God doesn't say, I'll take his soul. And if a person gives $1 million to charity, God doesn't say, you're my partner in creation. But the judge who renders a truthful verdict, decision, God says, you're my partner in creation. And the one who issues a corrupt verdict, even if it's as much as a penny, God says, I will take you out. Why in the context of the judicial system, God says it has this unlimited value, or it has this level of detriment of liability, which is not to be believed. Why? So let's talk. We find at the beginning of creation, we know that the appellation for God, which is the attribute of justice, is Elokim. The appellation for God, which is the attribute of mercy, is Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the four-letter name of God. That's mercy. The Torah begins, Bereshis bara Elokim. In the beginning, Elokim created. And then the Torah says, and Elokim said, the first day, the second day, the third day, it's Elokim continuously. And all of a sudden, when it comes to the human being, it says Hashem Elokim. God coalesces the attribute of mercy into judgment. So Rashi cites the Midrash. Initially, it says the attribute, it was created with the precision of the attribute of justice, which means that man has to behave perfectly, and if he should deviate, he's going to have the brunt of judgment. And then it says, no, there's rachmim, there's mercy. God gives you all the time in the world to make amends for the wrong you did. Why? Because man himself is prone to fail. We're subject to the evil inclination. And if God would take out a person immediately, you understand, the world's not going to last very long. The world cannot survive divine justice. Impossible. And because the world cannot survive divine justice, he coalesced into justice the attribute of mercy. So even though man fails, he can always do tshuva, or even if he doesn't do tshuva, he could do other good things later. But if he takes them out immediately, there's no future. Therefore, God gives a person endless chances to either make amends, repent, or to continue utilizing his life to do good things. That he should be meritorious. That's the attribute of mercy. But why did God initially, why was the intent, the ultimate intent was the attribute of justice? What's justice? Justice is exactness. If you run a tight ship, as they say, that everything is valued and you're bound to a standard of exactness, you know what the world is going to look like? You got a perfect world. But you realize you're not going to have many people walking the face of that earth. Because if we hold everything to the standard of exactness, you're not going to have many survivors. So for the sake of humanity, so even the world won't be that perfect, but for the sake of humanity, to give man the chance to achieve and accomplish, God says there's mercy. But one thing we do see, the human being, because he's prone to fail, he has to be held to a standard of accountability. That he has to have. So even though there's no divine justice, there has to be minimally human justice. You have to have a court system. There are laws, and people are bound by those laws. And if you break those laws, there's liability. And the person is punished if he breaks those laws. What are the laws on the terrestrial level? That's called the judicial system. Every community must have a court. Every municipality must have a court. You have a lower court, a higher court, whatever it is, doesn't make a difference. But people have to know that they're accountable for their behavior. But you realize human justice is not divine justice. It's a lot softer. The world continues if you have justice in place. But if you have justice, you have a modicum of orderliness and the world functions. But what about if the judge is corrupt? So the reason God is saying like this, why didn't I implement divine justice? Because the world can't survive. Why was the world destroyed at the time of the Great Flood? It was the attribute of justice. Because God gave the world every chance to recover and make amends and behave. They turned their backs on God. God said, if that's the case, I will implement the attribute of justice. We don't differentiate. Whether you're tzaddik, not tzaddik, you can't be perfect enough if the evaluation is exactness, the attribute of justice. God destroyed the world. The only survivor was Noach and his family. They were the only survivors. So what is the value of having an earthly court? They are the ones who hold mankind responsible and they're bound by the standard of justice. Well, what happens if there's no justice on the terrestrial level? You have to have justice. Without justice, man is a wild card. It's like cutting a ship from its moorings and the current just takes him out to sea and self-destructs. You have to have something to keep man in check. What keeps man in check? Human justice. What happens if there's no human justice? Because the judges are corrupt. You know what God says? To keep the world going, maintain, there has to be a modicum of orderliness. Then there has to be divine justice. If God forbid there's divine justice, the world does not survive. Or there can be many casualties. There's going to be much pain, much suffering. Could you hold just one moment? I'm sorry, I'm just interrupt for. So as a result of that, a person steals $1 million. The failing is not, it wasn't adjudicated and justice wasn't implemented. The man is a criminal. He has to be reined in by the court. But if the court does what it's supposed to do, implements justice, that's human justice. God doesn't have to intervene. So if the court maintains its standard and implements justice, what happens? There's no divine justice. So why does the world continue to thrive and exist? Due to the integrity of that judge. God says, if that's the case, you know who you are? You're my partner in creation. Because you could have been corrupt, but you chose to sue my persona, my signet, the signet of truth. As long as the court reflects the signet of truth, which they're bound to, human justice is sufficient. We don't need divine justice. But what happens if the court renders a decision, although it's a penny? Where did you fail? It's not the money. There's no terrestrial justice. There's no justice on terrestrial level. If there's no justice on terrestrial level, there must be divine justice. So why is all the suffering going to come about? Because it is judge being corrupted. Being a corrupt judge, that's why. So therefore, you steal $1 million, you're not corrupting justice. You corrupt, but it's not a corruption of the judicial system. But if you corrupt the institution called court, the court system, then God says, now I have to take over. If God has to take over with his divine justice, the world will be pretty much beaten pretty badly and hurt very badly. And whose cause of that? The judge who chose to be corrupt. Therefore, it has that level of liability for that reason. Now, it's very interesting. The world itself, why does the world exist? For the nations of the world. And this is not a elitist position. At Sinai, God said, initially God said when he created this world, I created the world for one objective, for the fulfillment of the Torah. The world is created deficient. You have to advance it to a level of perfection that mankind could have a relationship with me. How is that done? Through the mechanism called Torah, which is the positive negative commandments. Okay? God goes to all the nations of the world, he says, do you want to accept my prescription of life, my protocol of life? Every one of them turned them down. But God says, you realize, I will only will this world and maintain it if the world is the location for my Torah. If not, God says, I stop willing existence. We go back to pre-existence. The only nation that accepted it were the Jewish people. We said Nasav Nishma. We accepted unequivocally at Sinai. We will meet the objective of creation. So why now does the world exist? It exists for the Jewish people. Because the Jewish people accepted the responsibility to implement the Torah, and that should be the parameters of their choice. So it's not an elitist position. It's a position of reality. You other people were offered, you turned it down. God says, I'm not maintaining this existence unless it's what the setting for the Torah. And if the only nation who agreed to accept the Torah are the Jewish people, the world exists for them. Because only they are the ones who actually are living by the standard called the Torah standard, for that reason. So let's talk now. The laws of the court system. So who's responsible for justice in this world? That the attribute of justice must be actualized in the context on the terrestrial level. The Gentile or the Jew? The Jew. Because it's within the context of Torah. It has to be within the context of truth. God's signet is truth. The Torah is truth. As King Solomon says in Mishlei, Emes Kenev al Timkor, acquire truth, don't sell it. So only through the truth of Torah can justice be actualized and implemented on the human standard. Although one of the 7 Noahide laws is they must establish a judicial system, but it's whatever laws they legislate themselves. And the level of truth doesn't have to be this way. For instance, in a non-Jewish court, a single witness qualifies as evidence. In a secular court, even if the witness is related, it's not a basis for disqualification. How many members do you have to convene on the court? Even one member is sufficient. As long as a person is qualified to be a judge, one is enough. You don't need 3, you don't need 23, you don't need 71, you don't need any of this. But for the Jew, because the Jew, he has to maintain the standard of justice. What's justice? That there should not be divine justice. That's truth. The only way you're able to implement truth within a human context is only through the Torah. Therefore, you must meet the criteria. So if the failing is in truth, and who's bound to the standard of truth? Only the Jew. Therefore, it's only the judge, the Jewish court, if the judge is corrupt, does it bring about divine justice. And if they maintain the system as it should be maintained within the context of truth, then those judges are responsible for why existence does exist, and they themselves are God's partners in creation for that reason. Very interesting. What's the law? Speak a little halacha here. You have 10 butcher shops in the city, 9 kosher, 1 non-kosher. You're walking down the street and you find a package of meat in the street. So you're not sure. The one who lost the meat in the street, he may have purchased it at the 9 of the kosher shops or maybe the non-kosher shop. As a very observant, devout Jew, are you permitted to eat that meat? So the law is, there is the law of probability. Probability says 9 to 1, it came from a kosher shop. And it's considered kosher meat. So I always ask a question. If you have a gun, it has 50 barrels, and you put a bullet into one of the barrels, and you spin the barrels, it's called playing Russian roulette, and you put the gun to a person's temple and say, I want you to spin the barrels and pull the trigger. Any person in his right mind, will he pull the trigger? Definitely not. He said, why not? You're probably not going to blow your brains out. Probably. The person says, it may be probably, but there's a chance I may. Am I going to take a chance on a probability? I wouldn't take the chance. My life's at stake. But yet, when it comes to these laws here, it's probably kosher. Is it probably kosher? Or it's definitely kosher? If you follow the logic, it's only probably kosher, but it's not definitely kosher. But yet the law is you're permitted to eat it. Why are you permitted to eat that meat? You know why? Because the Torah says when you have probability, you should deal with probability as fact. That's called kosher. Probability brings about a definiteness that's definitely kosher. If it would be up to us and we say, well, logically, probability, you go after the laws of probability, it's probably kosher. Probably kosher would not permit you to eat it. But it's only because the Torah says you have a right to rely on probability, that's why it's kosher. So why? So if the later turns out, the meat turned out to be not kosher, there's no liability to the one who ate that meat, because the Torah says that meat is definitely kosher. So, and you followed the protocol of the Torah. What the reality is not really important. Because as long as you follow the script, and the script says probability is definite, you're permitted to eat it. But all that goes into the context, that's the truthfulness. That's the truth of Torah. But why? Because that's the way God decided it. Because since the Torah is truth on an unadulterated, absolute level, therefore it's considered 100% permitted. Now, the Talmud uses a term, if the judge renders a judgment which is truthful on the absolute level. So the commentators ask, what do you mean on the absolute level? It's truthful or not truthful? What's on the absolute level? So the commentator on the page explains, known as Tosas, explains, what happens if the judge meets all the protocols of the court, all the criteria, the witnesses are interrogated, no discrepancies, and we issue a verdict, but afterwards the judges are not comfortable. There's something which they can't put their finger on it. It seems to be, it's not right. They have a certain sense it's not right. They have to disqualify themselves. They have to cancel it. Because it's not truth on the absolute level. Absolute means there's no concerns that maybe something's wrong with it. It's emes labito shel Torah. It's truth to the absolute truthfulness of Torah. The question is why? But I've gone through, I've done all my research, all my analysis, all my interrogation. Why? If you look in the Rambam, in the Fundamentals of Torah, he writes, who is God? God is truthful, is truth on the absolute level. That's who God is. Whatever God is, he's absolute. So if the insignia of God is truth, he's truth, and he's not dependent. His existence is not contingent on anything but himself being independent. He says that's called emes labito. He's truth on the absolute level. For the court to render a decision, which is a divine decision, that God convenes with that court, what level of truth does that decision have to be? It's reflecting what God is. God's truth is absolute. So therefore, if there's any qualm that there's maybe a question, it may not be absolute, God's not associated with that decision. The moment God's not associated with that decision, now it's subject to human error. It's not justice. It has to be similar to divine justice. Divine justice is truth, absolute truth. Within the terrestrial justice, the court, it has to be that, except it's manifests itself for the human condition, but it has to reflect that same truthfulness. Because without God's involvement, convening with that court, it's not truth. Because it has to reflect the truth of divine justice, and it's not. Therefore, God does not convene. Once he doesn't convene with that court, we got a problem. Because that's called human error. Subject to human error, you have no right to take a person's life. You have no right to do anything, to take anything from anybody. Therefore, it has to be emes la'amito shotor. It has to be on the absolute level. Anything less than that is not sufficient. There's an interesting midrash. One of the great rabbis of the Talmud, his name was Rav Asi. We speak about Rav Ami and Rav Asi, the great Torah sages of Israel, living in Israel at the time of Rabbi Yochanan. And Rav Asi, he was nearing the end of his life. And the Midrash quotes a verse in Mishlei, in Proverbs. Melech b'mishpat yamed oretz. The king, through justice, he establishes the land. How does the king secure the land? With justice. You know, we read in Pirkei Avos, you should pray for the welfare of government, because if there's no law and order, people will eat one another alive. Literally, people become predators. So how do you establish the stability and the orderliness of humanity? You have to have justice. So the king who renders justice, imposes justice, that land will thrive and function. Vish trumos. But a man of tithings, Yersen, he will destroy it. What does this mean? Now, when it says the king will establish justice and the world will continue, who's the king? Malchus Shel Torah. Who's the melech, the king? The royalty is the one who possesses that Torah at that special level. He's the one who is the judge who adjudicates all these issues between two defendants based on his Torah knowledge. The mishmit oser, due to the justice that he renders, that he issues, the world continues. Because due to being an honest judge and the court system functioning as it should be, the world continues. Vish trumas yarsenu. What is this trumas yarsenu? Im meisem atzmo kitruma hazo. Now, what is truma? Truma is when you tithe the grain or the produce of Israel, which you give to the Kohen. That tithing has a holiness to it. You have to really put it in the corner, not to expose it to any level of contamination. So you got to tuck it away somewhere. But let's say you have this great Torah sage. He tucks himself away the way you take the truma and put it away, remove it from society. And what does he say? You know something? I'm too busy with my studies. I don't have time to be involved listening to people's complaints against one another. And he doesn't want to be in a position to adjudicate, to bring about justice. So he behaves like the truma, like the tithe that's thrown in the corner. And what does this Torah sage say? What do I have to inconvenience myself, bother myself with the ongoings of the community? What do I have to be involved in there, adjudicating their laws? Do I have to listen to their complaints? Shalom alay nafshi. I prefer to live in peace, not bothered. I'll sit and study, not to be distracted. Hariz the machrav soul of that person who approaches the world with this attitude, he's the cause of the destruction of this world. Because he's credible and he should be involved. That he chooses to extricate himself and to turn his back on society and not to adjudicate, he's the cause the world be destroyed. And that's what it means, Ish Trumas Yarsena. The man who removes himself as not concerned, he will be the cause of the destruction of the world. Mar tells over a story, the Midrash. Maaseh Ravasi, there was an incident Ravasi, he was on his deathbed. Nichlas Berachosu Exlo, and his nephew, the son of his sister, comes to take leave of his uncle, to say farewell to his uncle. Matzo Boche, and he finds his uncle is sobbing. Amalo Rebbe, so he calls his uncle Rebbe, my teacher. Nemato Boche, why are you crying? Yesh Torah, Yesh Torah. Is there any Torah that you not study, did not teach? You're a great disseminator of Torah. You've done it all. You have all your exceptional students sitting in front of you. Is there any acts of loving kindness that you did not do? You gave charity, you helped the poor, you helped those who are in need of help. And your exemplary character was you didn't want to assume a position to be a judge, to sit on a court. You didn't want to be in a position to have any influence over the community. So he says to his nephew, what you're telling me is something positive. That's exactly why I'm crying. Why? Because maybe there'll be a retribution to me. When I pass away, there'll be an accountability. Why didn't you? You could have prevented so much if you would have been involved. That you turned your back and you want to live as a private citizen, you're liable for all that you could have prevented, which you did not prevent. That's exactly why I'm crying. I'm worried. Because the man who puts himself in the corner and is not involved, when he can be involved, he will destroy this world. What is it based on? As we just said, you have qualified judges, you maintain the standard of justice, Torah justice within the human context. But if you're not there to accommodate people, and justice doesn't function as within the context of truth, which is Torah, then the world is in jeopardy. Then there's divine justice. So as a result of this passivity, not being involved, you're the cause of why the world is being destroyed and all the suffering in the world. It's due to this man not wanting to get involved. That's what it's all about. There's a concept which the Talmud discusses, and it's a Torah concept. If a person sees something which is being done, which is incorrect, it's a violation of the Torah among your fellow Jews, and you could have interceded and intervened and prevented it from happening, and you chose not to get involved. But if you would have interceded, you could have prevented it from happening, and you did not. You're accountable for that action. Because due to your non-intervention, that's why it happened. If you would have intervened, it wouldn't have happened. So why did the wrong happen? Because you intervened. You did not intervene. You were passive. So let's say a person does intervene and he prevents it from happening. He's deserving of the end result that the wrong did not happen because he intervened. If I encourage a person to do a mitzvah, and he wouldn't have done the mitzvah unless I would have encouraged him to do it. Although you didn't actually actualize the mitzvah, but you had the impetus for that third party to do the mitzvah. The one who encouraged that person to do the mitzvah, he himself is fully deserving of credit for that mitzvah. Because if not for his intervention of encouragement, the mitzvah wouldn't have happened. So if you're passive and do your passivity, the transgression takes place, you have liability. And due to your involvement, the right thing takes place, then you're credited as if you did it, although you're only the impetus, you fully accredit as if you did the action itself. So what we said, what keeps the world going? The Jewish court or the non-Jewish court? It's the Jewish court. Because the only reason why there's no divine justice is because there's human justice, but that human justice is truth, and God convenes with that court. The non-Jewish court, God doesn't convene with that court. There's a judicial system. To maintain that communities, they have to have a judicial system. There has to be accountability. But the standard of that accountability is not the standard, it's not truth. It's only for the sake of maintaining a society. So therefore, when is there no divine justice? Divine justice is absolute, unadulterated truth. Human justice within the context of Torah is truth, unadulterated, within the context of absolute, because God convenes with that court. God does not convene with the court of the non-Jew. So the Jew goes to the secular court rather than to a Jewish court. The decision that's going to be rendered due to the ones who rendered that decision, is that a decision of unadulterated truth, or is it another kind of decision? Therefore, a Jew who goes to the non-Jewish court, it's a chil Hashem. You're desecrating God's name. Because if you were gone to a Jewish court, that's the decision I want, because that's God's decision. When you go to a non-Jewish court, that's not God's decision. That's a human decision. And therefore, Rashi cites the Midrash. It's as if you rejected God. If you go to a non-Jewish court where you could have gone to a Jewish court, it's as if kafar v'elokei Yisrael. You're actually denying the God of Israel. Why? Because if you could have had the God of Israel involved in the decision, the verdict, what he could have said, the answer is because it doesn't make a difference to me. He doesn't make a difference to me. So what? In actual, what are you saying? God is irrelevant. So going to the secular court, seeking out something which is not God's involvement, you're rejecting the God of Israel, and it's a chil Hashem. Why is it the discretion of God? Here the Jew goes and he turns his back on his own God. In addition, now there's going to be divine retribution, because the decision of the non-Jew doesn't prevent divine justice, because it's only human justice, because that's also God's justice. Therefore, not only turning your back on God, but all the problems which happen and this liability to Jewish people is due to this individual who went to the secular court rather than going to the Jewish court.